Having established a general framework of what is going on and why it's going on, as it is going on, we can proceed to formulate some reactions which may be innate, emerging from the nature past, the essence of man, as this is carried in his genes, despite being repressed, forgotten, denied, hated, etc., and some emerging from an honest and clear understanding of the past as a standard for evaluating not what should be done or ought to be done or we hope can be done, but what in fact can be done. In other words, what is more probable than not as a response to this ongoing human leveling and a blatant assault upon Western man, and in particular Western males, because females are more easily integrated and serve any master they consider superior. Now, the first criticism is that what is being proposed is inapplicable in this day and age, in this time and place. But then we can say the same for democracy, and we can say even worse about communism and its spiritual predecessor, Christianity. The latter have the added burden of proposing ideals which are contrary to human nature and to nature altogether. They completely exit the realm of probability and of possibility, although communism lingers on the edge and offers a supernatural, a contra-natural application beyond time and space. They defend themselves by claiming that it is man who sins or is unable to discipline himself to the ideal, and that the ideal itself is perfect or the better option, no matter if it produces the lesser outcome. Therefore, it isn't that communism or Christianity which is at fault if the communist or the Christian fails repeatedly to live up to his own ideals dogma. This in itself is the very basis of self-hating nihilism. The systems are so nihilistic, so anti-world, that what they propose can only apply to ideal life forms as they imagine them, whereas the real man continuously fails to live up to expectations, preserving him in a perpetual state of shame he must then make amends for by more severely repressing what he cannot contain for any prolonged period of time. Democracy was indeed applied once for a short while and under different to the present circumstances, but it was a symptom of the decline itself. We can say that democracy was a forced compromise, a compromise the previous system of democracy had to make so as to integrate the increasing numbers of people produced by its very success. A compromise forced upon the elite by an increasing general fatigue and a cultural fatigue and a momentary cultural decline due to historical events. The ideal of democratic institutions quickly faced the usual human corruptive effects, which turned the overt elitism of the time into a more covert form, which have continued on up until our time. The masses became convinced, seduced by the idea that they were in control and that their voice had weight, when all along a series of developments in mind manipulation reduced them to their usual state of blind, ignorant, easily manipulated automatons. The illusion sufficed to produce stability, which continues to remain effective. Democracy evolved into the most sophisticated form of human husbandry man ever envisioned. We might say that we still worship the democratic system because it was the first successful application of human husbandry on a grand scale. Communism simply dealt with the state-church separation by converting the church into a political ideal and by secularizing the Judeo-Christian ethos, which was later also integrated into capitalistic democratic systems in the form of further concessions to the Cold War dynamics. so as to silence the masses by keeping them dumb and numb. Concessions now being taken back after the branch of Judeo-Christianity and its methodology, we now call secular humanism or liberalism, had won over another variant with what we understand as conservatism falling within this dualistic paradigm, in the usual representation of both sides of the issue so as to maintain the illusion of choice. Despite these factors, democracy remains the most effective and just system ever invented, although its application would demand a return, which has to deal with situations that have already gone too far. A return highly problematic in this environment. It demands, for starters, a fundamental radical return to older values, which we call traditional, and a redefining of words which have been hijacked and warped through centuries of institutionalized nihilism. Words such as morality and justice, and words such as the very term nihilism itself, all of which must be reconnected to the world they have been torn away from. The return would force the masses who have been allowed to be born and to remain protected, inculcated over time with the comforting delusion that they are equal and that their opinions are just, as respectable as any others, and that they deserve without having to earn. It would force them to come to terms with some things that they could never come to terms with. The capitalist system offers a variant of what is required, but it imposes a rule which does not only permit wealth to exceed its utility, pooling it in a way which then enforces preservation, in other words, conservative politics, but it also promotes an elitism with no responsibility other than unreliable Christian moral application of charity or pity, also dependent upon the diminishing display of this feeling which is now worshipped, the feeling of pity, which the moderns call sympathy, sometimes calling it empathy because they're confused. Capitalism is produced by and it promotes misers, the hoarding of material in the form of representative money to deal with and to compensate for an inferior genetic inheritance, a symbolic inheritance of wealth to cope with a natural impoverishment of mind and body, or what we call spirit. Spirit being another word we must rescue from the clutches of the miserly world annihilators. This problem takes into account the natural blowback effect that is already in progress, as egalitarian morality and anti-life, anti-family, anti-blood, anti-existence nihilism spreads, finding fertile grounds among the ill, the downtrodden, the weak, the cowardly, the stupid, the desperate. An internal fragmentation is on its way. Genetic uniformity increases, resulting in race mixing, dysgenics, and as a consequence, mimetic fragmentation increases proportionally. This only serves to attenuate the already tenuous internal psychological stresses civilization produces. The neurosis of civilization or civilized behavior reaches a breaking point. Social eugenics, the moderns call education, civility, goodness, health, to hide the fact that what is occurring is an intervention upon genetic dispositions, unprecedented in the history of mankind, and unmatched by the fabled Nazi institutions which had evolved beyond force, and now use inconspicuous coercion, Bernays style, where the individual is indoctrinated, brainwashed, manipulated using the very drives which are then denied reality to create a mindset conducive to replicating the ideal for them man. The ideal man being more woman, in uncreative, by the book, bland, unwilling, and unable to think outside the social, cultural, economic box, and more so outside the dualism of nihilism, the binary logic of nihilism. We look to the east to see the outcome. For those who think feminization is all good, with no important side effects, all they have to do is look to where the process has progressed to a point where it is obvious. Reduction of the masculine traits means a reduction of creative thinking, of ingenuity, of humor, of the Hellenic daemon or daemon, a coming modern man, bland, repeating the communal beliefs verbatim, unable to construct or to think of anything without a recipe book, a directive manual, reduced to the level of imitation. See how in the East they take Western innovation, ingenuity, and make them more efficient and apply them within different contexts. Some celebrate the domination of females in academics, but it is really an indication of this feminization where an average or slightly above average mind is required for most disciplines. Minds only required to memorize and to then regurgitate and apply precedent, to follow recipes and rules, go through a step-by-step application of human knowledge, which is inherited, in other words, it's second-hand, and requires only minimal personal input. Techniques and technologies are constructed so that an average mind can use them. Their function is egalitarian, producing the illusion of parity through their compensating effects. The compensating effect of techniques and technologies have shifted the burden to mechanisms, turning men into mechanical facilitators, followers, maintenance crews. The hope, the romantic idealism, being that machinery will evolve as rapidly or more so than this cognitive decline, taking over the burden and relegating man as a passive perpetual recipient of the outcome, a uniformity of humanity as masters over the slave machinery, the perfect egalitarian utopia, similar to the communist ideal, and reflecting the more primitive Christian Islamic promise. Each and every nihilist has already exposed his existential angst, and unlike a healthy individual, he hides it, he represses it, he converts it into something positive instead of speaking it openly and honestly. The linguistic form this angst expresses itself through will reveal its organic source. For instance, the usage of value as the mechanism to escape reality and the cold harshness of judgment has to do with seeing and the visual component of the human species, we being more predator than prey, at least before nihilism has infected us. It has to do with being seen and acknowledged, placing value before or outside the domain of judgment, of consciousness and perception indicates a reluctance to reveal self and a need to be appreciated no matter how one appears, to be valued for simply appearing. Of course, other components of the particular individual must be studied to construct a more complete picture, a more complete psychological picture. But this focus on the term value offers a founding psychological motive having to do with perception and visual appreciation. The fact that the individual chose that word is enough for us to take it as being more fundamental in his thinking, in his psychology, in his motives. The desire to be valuable before there is a judging mind to value is indeed revealing. The same analysis can be applied about all linguistic forms of nihilism. For example, the imbecile that proposes value before or detached from judgment is obviously suffering from a desperate need to be appreciated positively without being judged. The weakling that proposes love with no survival motives is desperate for unconditional love. The repressed mind proposing pleasure that determines taste or pleasure detached from need is really crying out for a validation of pleasures. It is a bit apprehensive about secret desires it may not feel ashamed of, but it knows will lead to unpredictable consequences if exposed honestly, and so on. The psychological implications run the gamut of neurological conditions produced by modern systems and the neurosis of self-repression and psychological schism that may manifest as narcissism or may take the route towards self-annihilation. Each and every nihilist has already exposed his existential angst, and unlike a healthy mind, he represses it, he hides it, he converts it into something positive. The linguistic form this angst expresses itself through will reveal its organic source. For instance, the usage of value as the mechanism to escape reality and the cold harshness of judgment has to do with seeing and the visual component of the human species, because we are after all predators before we are reduced to domesticated prey. It has to do with being seen and being acknowledged. Placing value before or outside the domain of judgment, placing it before consciousness and perception indicates a reluctance to reveal self and a need to be appreciated no matter how one appears, to be valued for simply appearing. Of course, other components of the particular individual must be studied to construct a more complete picture. But this focus on the term value offers a founding psychological motive having to do with perception and visual appreciation. The desire to be valuable before there is a judging mind to value is indeed revealing. Same analysis can be made about all linguistic forms of nihilism. For example, like we already said, the imbecile that proposes value before or detached from judgment is obviously suffering from a desperate need to be appreciated positively without being judged. The weakling that proposes love with no survival motives is desperate for unconditional love. The repressed mind proposing pleasure that determines taste or pleasure detached from need is crying out for a validation of pleasures. Pleasures it is a bit apprehensive about. Secret desires it may not feel ashamed of, but that it knows will lead to unpredictable consequences if exposed honestly, and so on. The psychological implications run the gamut of neurological conditions produced by modern systems and the neurosis of self-repression and psychological schisms that may manifest as narcissism or may take the route, a different route towards self-annihilation. And now, living in this modern age where the majority are busy gossiping about who fucked who and how, bar hopping followed by pleasure with no price and no meaning, mindless mental masturbation until the beat of rap soundtracks full of bling bling, and look how great and how many bitches I fuck in my luxurious crib with my bouncing ride in the garage, sporting rotating rims that scream, "Look at me," and a popular pseudo-intellectualism that has become this endless discussion of nonsense, repeatedly asking, is there a God, or what is love, refusing to accept the explanations because they want to mystify it and retain the ignorance that makes these concepts so appealing to them, or some other pseudo-intellectual lollipop like the brain and the vat, and so, or something like that, or in an age trying to find an alternate word to replace the term God, reinventing the wheel but still offering that easy mass comfort that excludes nobody of good faith, also screaming, I am great, I am genius, look how brilliant I am, I've cured cancer, look how valuable I am, I have been born, with that same numerical synchronicity that begs for a reason, a purpose, salvation from need, suffering. We must now rediscover knowledge older than old, because although human artifices and lies change in their usage of symbols, reality cares not and is affected not by such infantile tactics. It is perhaps harsh to accept the world with its indifferent challenges and its uncertainties, but if we fail to do so, it is not the world that will suffer or that is at fault. And because it does not and cannot suffer or bear the fault, it cannot care. Only humans, conscious beings, care, and that's why they evaluate and they value. To the inversion of nihilistic noumenon with no reference to phenomena, we must now offer an antidote, as a medical doctor offers medicine, pharmakon, as the Greeks used to call it, to his ailing patient, knowing that in the end, if he, the patient, cannot endure, he will not survive, and should not survive. When they speak of an end to discrimination, we must now make ours more profound. When they speak of equality, obsessing over the minuteness of similarity to construct this universal uniformity edifice upon which we must construct our delusions, we, as more rational human beings, must point to the divergence that screams its presence everywhere and anywhere, at all times and in all places. When words are offered with no connection to anything experienced, detached in a degree where they can be placed inside or outside, before or after, losing all utility except as a pacifier for infantile psychologies to suckle upon, we must reconnect words to their origins, find the etymologies and the reference points which by order will disarm these buffoons and render their words mute and dull like their minds. When they declare appearance superficial, or that humanity has nothing to do with genes and reproduction, sex, we must follow through with their logic, exposing the stupidity and the anxiety, fear, and selectivity underlying its application. When they offer all inclusion, wanting to gain power through quantities, we will begin by exclusions, judging not to include, but to exclude. When they dream of mass appreciation and popularity, we will find honor in elitism, in aristocracy, and validity not in quantities but in qualities, knowing that less is indeed more, and where superfluity and abundance is now how they numb themselves. Austerity will be our claim to the aristocratic